Too. So welcome everyone, and thanks again for joining us tonight for another Massachusetts Peace Action webinar, a discussion on Palestine, sanctions, and American exceptionalism with Peter Beinart. I'm sure most of the people on the call tonight know Peter Beinart, but a little more information on him. He's the editor-at-large of Jewish Currents. He's a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace and a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. He's also a professor of journalism and political science at the Newmark School of Journalism at the City University of New York. He's also the author of several books, such as The Crisis of Zionism and The Icarus Syndrome. Both of which I would recommend. You can get those at your local library or your local bookseller. And he's also the author of a newsletter that we will put up the link to. So you can subscribe to Peter's Substack. But tonight we're going to be talking about, as I mentioned, Palestine, Israel, sanctions, and American exceptionalism, all of which Peter has written about in the New York Times just, I think, in the last 6 months. So Peter, introduce yourself to the Mass Peace Action audience.
It's really nice to be with you. I wish it was in person since I'm from Massachusetts originally, so it would be a homecoming for me of sorts, but appreciate it that we can do it virtually.
Well, thank you for agreeing to be on with us. You write on so many of the subjects that we talk about at Mass Peace Action all the time, not just the ones I listed, the military budget. You've even written recently on US-China relations. So we could talk to you all night, but let's get into what we agreed to talk about. Just in the book that I mentioned, The Crisis of Zionism, which I believe came out in 2012, in the conclusion of that book, you wrote that American Jews needed to reconcile Israel's democratic and Zionist ideals in this generation, or that the next generation would have to decide between them. That book was written about almost 10 years ago. How do you feel about the events that have transpired in the last year, and especially in the last month, as it relates to that sentence that you wrote 10 years ago?
So I think, unfortunately, the last, the events of the last 10 years, I think, have reaffirmed many of the fears that I had when I wrote that book about the degree to which oppression of Palestinians was a permanent, had become a kind of permanent feature of the Israeli state, and so and the degree to which the notion of partition between a Jewish and Palestinian state, so that at least Palestinians would no longer be stateless, that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem would have their own country of which they could be citizens, has become more and more and more remote. And so I myself have my views have had to evolve in response to events. And although I would still consider myself a Zionist, I would now consider myself a cultural Zionist, not a political Zionist. So that may seem obscure to some people, but there's a cultural Zionist tradition which roots to people like Achad Ha'am and then Martin Buber and Judah Magnus, who believed in the importance of a Jewish society in Israel-Palestine, of a thriving Jewish community, what you could call a Jewish home, but not a Jewish state, and believed that this Jewish society could, in fact, and should, in fact, live under a condition of equality with Palestinians. And so that is a move for me away from political Zionism, which is the idea that there should be a state that privileges Jews over Palestinians. I think that's no longer realistic because I think partition is no longer possible. And I've also come to believe that that it doesn't address certain really important fundamental underlying questions, like the right of Palestinian refugees to return, or some of the inherent conflicts between the notion of liberal democracy and equality under the law on the one hand, and the notion of a state that has an ethno-religious character on the other.
Thanks. Can you talk a little bit more about the state of a two-state solution, and why you feel that partition is no longer possible, and just about the commitment to a two-state solution that remains among so many American politicians?
Yeah, so I think it's first, I addressed this a bit in an essay I wrote last year for Jewish Currents called Yavno, which was an argument for equality in one political entity in Israel-Palestine. I think the first thing to recognize about the two-state solution is that even under the best of circumstances, there are very fundamental issues that it would not have solved. So for instance, even if Palestinians had their own state in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, 20% of Israel's own citizens in Israel proper are Palestinians. They sometimes get called Arab Israelis, but they're Palestinians. And those Palestinians who represent 20% and could over time represent 30% of the Israeli population are second-class citizens, because the nature of a Jewish state by its very nature suggests that the state has obligations to its Jewish citizens that it does not have to them. And this plays itself out in a whole series of ways that mean that Palestinian citizens do not enjoy equality. And just as, most American Jews would not be comfortable in a country that privileged Christians over Jews, most Palestinian citizens understandably want equality under the law. They don't want to be second-class citizens. So a two-state solution would not have solved that. As conventionally understood, a two-state solution would also not have allowed Palestinian refugees to return to within Israel proper, at least not in any significant number. And I think there are also some very kind of, as I wrote in a piece just recently called Tshuva, a Jewish case for Palestinian refugee return, I think that there are very basic questions of justice, particularly about whether we as Jews who returned to what we call Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, after 2,000 years, have the right to deny Palestinians who were expelled 75 years ago, or their children or grandchildren. But I think one could have said that the two-state solution was at least a step forward in the process of a more fundamental solution, because it would have ended one particularly oppressive reality, which was the millions of Palestinians in the West Bank who live under military law, the Palestinians in Gaza who live under blockade, the Palestinians in East Jerusalem who are not Israeli citizens. And yet I think that the reality is that Israel's control over the West Bank is now probably too deeply entrenched to imagine that partition taking place. It's interesting, if you go back to the early 1980s, you can find prominent Israeli commentators like Amos Oz and American commentators like Thomas Friedman basically saying, the two-state solution is virtually on its last legs because we now have 150,000 settlers in the West Bank. You now have 650,000, including East Jerusalem. And even that really understates the extent of it. If any of you have been there, nothing about this looks temporary. It's virtually impossible to find a Hebrew language map put out by the state of Israel that even acknowledges the boundary between the West Bank and Israel. It's thoroughly integrated into the state, massive infrastructure, Israel's newest medical school, vast industrial and agricultural enterprises. So this is really nothing, and Israel's also now controlled the West Bank for more than 2/3 of its history. Israel was only a country for less than 20 years before it controlled the West Bank, and it's now controlled it for more than 50. So I think it makes more sense to think about this territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea as one integrated political unit, and then think about how it could be that one could have safety and justice and freedom for both populations in that territory.
And why do you think American politicians are still so wedded to this idea of the two-state solution? It's almost like a mantra, especially among Democratic politicians. It seems natural to me that a society that had a separation of church and state, much like ours, no establishment of religion, is literally the first sentence of the Bill of Rights. Right. Why doesn't this translate more easily to American politics?
It's a good point, right? One would say, looking at the American experience, or at least our aspirations for the United States, the aspirations that progressives have, right? The more natural move would be to say people live together with equality under the law in a state that has no religious character, rather than the idea of partition into two ethno-religious states. And yet, I think that that's still, Rashida Tlaib is the only member of Congress who takes that view. And I think that the reason is because although many Democrats recognize to some degree that Israeli control over stateless Palestinians is a problem, the notion of there not being a Jewish state is a bridge too far for them. That there's a kind of a strong kind of inherited legacy of the idea that Jews deserve a state of their own, you know. And look, this is no longer a view that I hold, but I can certainly understand why many in the Jewish community, and also people who see themselves as sympathetic to Jews, given our history of powerlessness and suffering, would say in a post-Holocaust world, you know, Jews need one country in the world that privileges and protects them in particular, even though there may be a genuine conflict and tension between that ideal and the ideal of equality under the law. But the reality is that I think that where the conversation needs to go is towards being able to think about, to move beyond the notion that equality in Israel-Palestine means that Jews become imperiled, and actually start to understand that I think in the longer term, I believe that Jews as well as Palestinians are safer in a country which has equality under the law, that societies that give everyone a voice in government, that allow political participation by people of all groups, tend to be more peaceful and stable for everybody than countries in which one side is basically locked out of political power and denied basic rights. And so although it's a difficult conceptual leap for many people, a difficult emotional leap for many people, and obviously a pretty big political lift, since this is still outside the bounds of mainstream political discourse, I do think that in the next 5 or 10 years, you will see more progressive Democrats starting to look afresh at this idea, because the status quo is simply not morally acceptable. And I also think the status quo is a recipe for violence and war, which ultimately imperils not only Palestinians, but also Israeli Jews.
And how do you feel about the activism that has sprung up in the last month in response to the increased violence? I say increased violence because the occupation is always violent. Yes. But what do you think about the outpouring of support for the Palestinians' right to return and against illegal settlement? Do you feel that change that you're talking about occurring in the next 5 to 10 years, do you feel that this is a sign of things to come, what we've seen in the last month?
I definitely think what we're seeing is we're seeing some shift in public opinion. There's no question about it. Certainly public opinion among Democrats. And you're also seeing some shift in the media. So that I think that Black Lives Matter has made people in the media, the mainstream media, more conscious of questions of representation and more aware than they were in the past of the really appalling absence of Palestinian voices from the conversation about Israel-Palestine. So I think that although there's still a ways to go, I think that in general, there's been more representation of Palestinian voices than there has been that's in previous wars between Israel and Gaza. And that when you put Palestinian voices on, things are said often that are not said when Palestinians are not present, and it changes the conversation in some really important ways. I think the big question for me would be, how much do these political and cultural changes translate into policy, right? We're all aware that, I mean, to take the defense budget, which is an issue you work on, or gun control, right? There are plenty of issues where we can see that public opinion does not translate into government policy very effectively, especially in an environment where you have the Republican Party moving to really block the democratic transmission mechanisms by making it harder and harder for people to vote. right? So you have, and while we're seeing some progress in the Democratic Party, the Republican Party has gone backward. I mean, it's worth remembering that it was the last president who actually wielded genuine pressure on Israel on the settlements policy was a Republican, George H.W. Bush. It's inconceivable now. And there were Republicans in Congress who took that position. That is completely gone from the Republican Party now. So while there is some genuine movement happening, I think there are also, you know, there's an entire other political party in the United States, the Republican Party, and there are significant, I think, questions about the ability of public opinion to translate into government policy. And so I think it's still too early to say that we're seeing a fundamental shift in US policy.
Yeah, and impatience and righteous impatience is leading activists and just everyday people to look at different ways to pressure the state of Israel. I know our next subject that we're going to be talking about is sanctions, and I think a good segue there is just to get your thoughts briefly on grassroots resistance and resistance that's advocated by the Palestinian community, and that is individual boycotts, calls to divest, and sanctions.
Right. So I think that, you know, as you say, BDS stands for boycott, divestment, and sanction. And I think that at least the way I tend to think about it is to disaggregate those three and think about which specific moves I think make sense to me. So I certainly think, for instance, that the United States should condition military aid to Israel the United States U.S. aid should not be used for really barbaric practices like demolishing homes or imprisoning Palestinian children, and nor should the U.S. Nor should the U.S. give unconditional aid to an Israeli government that is moving in exactly the wrong direction in their overall policies. And I also don't believe the United States should be shielding Israel in international institutions like the UN and the International Criminal Courts. I don't believe the US should give unconditional military aid to any country. I think that, you know, when one is looking at the question of some form of sanctions vis-a-vis Israel versus US sanctions policy on Iran or Venezuela or Cuba or North Korea or Syria, I think it's important to think about a couple of principles that are important to think about sanctions in general. The first is there a call from within the community of people who are being denied basic rights for those sanctions, right? It seems to me there's no question that sanctions can impose a cost on people in a society, including people in that society who are already suffering lacking basic rights, right? I mean, this was one of the big arguments made against sanctions against South Africa. People said Black South Africans will suffer, which was true. In the short term, some Black South Africans did suffer. And yet people responded, they said, well, the most legitimate representatives of Black South Africans, the African National Congress, are calling for sanctions. So there seems to have been some willingness on the part of Black South Africans to accept some short-term pain in an effort for medium or longer-term justice. And so I think that that's one important question to ask. Is the suffering population here actually asking for this kind of economic pressure or not? In the case of Iran, for instance, as far as I'm aware, the large majority of dissidents in Iran do not support US sanctions policies in Iran. The second question I think it's important to ask is, are these sanctions sanctions that really would deny people the kind of necessities of life? I don't have a problem with targeted sanctions against members of the Iranian regime or the North Korean regime. I think these are really nasty, inhumane, despotic regimes. I don't have a problem with targeted sanctions against those leaders. But what I do have a problem with is sanctions that make it that prevent ordinary Iranians from basically getting the medicines they need to live, right? That basically sink the Iranian economy and drive people into poverty. So I would not support those kind of sanctions against any country. right? So so for me, the question is whether it's Israel, Palestine, or some other country is these twofold. First of all, what do we know about what kind of call is being made from the people whose rights are being denied? And secondly, are the sanctions targeted in such a way so they're not actually denying people the basic necessities of life? And so those are, for me, the two criteria that I would use for any question of sanctions.
Thanks. And I do think it is really important to break it down and say, what do we mean by sanctions? I know that you've written extensively about sanctions, and there should be a difference between weapon sales, for instance, especially offensive weapons, and things that human beings need to live, food that's imported, medical supplies. But as you yourself have written, the line between those is not always clear. I believe you wrote about the sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s, and just the broad definition of what could be considered to be a war-related item really did hurt the people of Iraq.
Absolutely. I mean, so one of the things that happened in the Iraq case was that the US, using its influence at the UN, drew such an absurdly broad definition of what could have a military use that literally everything from dental equipment to saline solution to many of the things that would be normally used. I mean, the truth is that if defined broadly enough, anything can have dual use technology, right? And so what happened was that under that rubric, the United States and its allies, especially really the United States, basically blocked Iraq from getting anywhere near the basic necessities of life, and really in a dramatic way kind of de-developed that country, and also prevented it from rebuilding from the destruction that had taken place in the Gulf War. And what I wrote about in the New York Times op-ed is that I fear, unfortunately, in a certain way, Iraq has become a kind of template for US policy towards a whole series of other adversarial regimes, which is to say, we don't like these regimes in these countries. In many cases, we have good reason not to like them. They're repressive, brutal regimes. The North Korean regime may be the worst regime in the world. But instead of looking, and we don't want to invade because we've kind of lost our appetite for that, at least for the moment, right? But we're also not really willing to pursue diplomacy because diplomacy requires give and take, right? And so it requires coming to terms with the fact that we're probably not able to stop North Korea from having nuclear weapons, right? That the real diplomacy would mean us probably having to concede that while we may be able to limit their nuclear arsenal, we can't actually repeal it. And that would reflect, or that would force us to actually accept the reality of how much power America has in the world. And so there's this refusal to actually accept the actual amount of power we have. And this, I think, really twisted moral argument that says that the most moral thing to do is to have nothing to do with these despotic regimes, even though and impose a virtual siege on them, even though in so doing we massively harm the population that is already suffering under these repressive regimes. And that's considered to be the more moral position. Whereas in fact, I think the more moral position is, and probably the position that is more likely to lead to political change in these societies, is to have more openness and more diplomacy and allow more bring these kind of try to bring more foreign influences into these often closed societies. And that would be better for its people and better for their long-term prospects. But this politically is virtually impossible to do right now. And so you see that the Biden administration has not really revisited in a significant way most of these sanctions policies at all.
Yeah, that segues us into our next topic, although I don't want to leave sanctions just yet, but this is another example of American hubris and a belief in American exceptionalism as I see it. But what you just brought up reminds me of something that recently happened at Tufts University right around the corner, and that's the closure of the Confucius Institute, which is an educational exchange program where Chinese professors come here, American professors go to China. And it was closed because of alleged human rights abuses in China. And we see this with individual sanctions even that are placed on diplomatic personnel. So even the sanctions that aren't so broad, even when countries get to sanctioning each other's diplomats, I feel like that can only drive a greater wedge between two nations, when what we need is more diplomacy.
Yes. So let me start by saying I don't think these are, in the case of China, one doesn't have to say alleged human rights abuses. I mean, there are terrible human rights taking place in China. What's happened in Hong Kong with the kind of destruction of the limited freedom that people in Hong Kong had, I think has been really awful. I also, and even more dramatically, of course, in Xinjiang, where you have these massive internment camps and what has been called by many a genocide. I think that I don't have personally a problem with certain targeted sanctions against Chinese officials who work on Hong Kong or in Xinjiang, especially if there are credible voices among Uyghurs or among people in Hong Kong who are asking the United States to do that. But where I think what we've moved way beyond that towards a kind of a neo-Cold War posture towards China, which first of all is not likely to have any success in ultimately helping the human rights in Hong Kong or in Xinjiang. Probably what it does is, by making America seem like this threatening enemy, it simply makes it easier for the kind of, the dictatorship in China to basically whip up nationalist sentiment and basically try to discredit anyone who actually wants to speak in behalf of freedom in China, and basically just label them an American agent, especially again, in a country which has a history of Western imperialism. And so is where a lot of people are highly sensitive to the notion of basically Western countries kind of interfering and telling them what to do. And I think that what I worry about is that that not enough people in Washington have fully taken on board how costly the Cold War was, the first Cold War was. First of all, I think it's actually a Cold War with China in some ways is even more costly because the necessity for cooperation with China is arguably greater, right? We needed to cooperate with the Soviet Union, certainly on arms control. We need to do that, but we also need to cooperate with China massively. We need to cooperate on climate change, since we are the two greatest contributors to this, and a Cold War environment makes that harder. We also need to contribute desperately. We need to cooperate with them to make sure that we don't see more pandemics that kill vast numbers of people around the world. That kind of cooperation. I mean, if you ask me, in what ways does China most endanger the United States? I would say the two greatest dangers that China poses to the United States are its contribution to climate change and its contribution to pandemics. Both of those threats to ordinary Americans can only be effectively responded to through cooperation. And a Cold War posture makes that cooperation much more difficult. And also, Cold Wars, what we learned in the first Cold War is that Cold Wars empower the national security state in the United States in ways that invariably lead to a degradation of civil liberties and civil rights in the United States. We see now with the FBI, with the FBI's kind of massive kind of investigations of many Chinese and Chinese American researchers, most of whom, as far as I know, are having their careers destroyed, not because they're even being accused of espionage. Basically, what they're being accused of is not having filled out some requisite disclosure form back from a time 10 years ago when they were being encouraged to do joint work with Chinese institutions. And now the pendulum has shifted, and now they're having their careers ruined because they didn't fill out some form that basically said they were working with a Chinese university. And I think that it's important to say that, again, human rights criticisms of China is not necessarily anti-Chinese or anti-Asian, right? Many people in China themselves are calling for these criticisms. But when you feed paranoia about China. And you basically say things like China is about to take over the United States, is about to take over the world. That's when you create a climate of hysteria that again evokes the hysteria in the 1950s during the McCarthy era. And that's when I think you can see how that feeds into this violence against Chinese and Asian Americans that we're seeing tragically having grown in the last year.
Yeah, and we're deeply concerned about that here at Massachusetts Peace Action, that the anti-China rhetoric of the Trump administration, which was flagrant and pretty openly racist, has contributed to Asian hate. But we're also worried about a continuation of some of these same policies in the Biden administration, even if he's using different language. I saw that as a sub-theme of his State of the Union was we need to invest in our country so we can beat China. And it's just not the mind frame that helps us solve these global problems that we desperately need to solve. But I'm glad that you explained it so fully, because I think there's a lot of people on this call right now who are skeptical about things that the Trump administration and now the Biden administration are saying about human rights in China, and are very skeptical because they have seen the United States use human rights as a way to undermine other governments and prepare for war against them. I think we saw this in the case of Iraq, for instance. I think maybe the best example. But just to comment, just to make it perfectly clear, China is one of the most powerful governments on the planet. It is authoritarian in nature, although it's not totalitarian as it once was. So to think that in a country of over 1 billion people that there aren't human rights violations, I think is pretty naive. Just to be clear, but it's desperately important that we don't let that be used to prepare for a new Cold War, which is going to imperil not only all of the citizens of China, but Americans and everyone in between.
Yeah, I entirely agree. And I think that, unfortunately, I think the Biden administration finds itself in this position where they may feel that only by using this Cold War rhetoric can they get the Republican Party to support investments in infrastructure, right? Because unless it has unless there's an adversary there, that's the only way they can politically sell these efforts. But I think that the problem is that, and I think this was partly the lesson of Lyndon Johnson's administration, right? Lyndon Johnson was someone who did pursue very ambitious domestic policy agendas. In some ways, that Biden is the most ambitious president in terms of these domestic efforts at strengthening the U.S. welfare state since Johnson. And of course, Johnson also, moved America into Vietnam. And ultimately, I think what we saw was that the guns and butter in this analogy, the guns ultimately trumped the butter. That ultimately, that the war in Vietnam was ultimately, this is one of the Martin Luther King talked about, was ultimately devastating for progressive efforts at home. And so I think we have to be more aware than I fear the Biden administration is of the ways in which a Cold War posture with China, for instance, as we say, it makes it impossible to cut the defense budget. Right? I mean, there might have been an opportunity to cut the defense budget because ISIS, which had been this big justification for it, is basically, virtually moribund now. And yet, lo and behold, kind of China emerges just in time to basically give a huge new shot in the arm. And sooner or later, that there are going to be trade-offs between that defense spending and the kind of domestic spending that Biden wants to pursue.
Yeah, you wrote extensively in your book Icarus about American hubris, about the inability of America to rationally perceive threats. Do you feel that is a problem going forward? That we see every adversary as basically another Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan that needs to be defeated? And we see no room for other great powers that are naturally going to have spheres of influence.
Yes. I mean, what's interesting about the United States at the dawn of the Cold War was that the United States essentially actually did, to some degree, accept the Soviet Union having a sphere of influence. It's interesting that, during the end of World War II, there were people who pushed Eisenhower to march U.S. troops further into Eastern Europe to try to secure those territories so the Soviets wouldn't control them. And let's be clear, they would have been better off. People in Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia would have been better off if they had come under the American sphere of influence. But Eisenhower basically said, listen, the American people are not willing to lose troops in a fight over a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. And then, when in 1956, when the Hungarians rose up, in 1968, when the Czechs rose up, the Soviets responded with these brutal crackdowns, which were horrific. But the United States did not go to war over those areas because they recognized, tragically, right, that they were in the Soviet sphere of influence and it mattered more to the Soviet Union. What happened is, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it essentially lost its sphere of influence, and American power stretched much further east, right onto former Soviet soil. And now under Putin, the Russians have tried to reassert some of that sphere of influence. And of course, China, as a growing power, is in some ways doing its version of what the United States did in 1898, right? When the United States, after growing much more economically powerful, the United States started to expanded in imperial ways into the Caribbean, into the Pacific. And so it's not at all surprising that China, given its economic power now, wants a sphere of influence, right? In the South China Sea. Of course, they want to incorporate Taiwan, islands off of Japan. And I think these are very difficult. These are not easy policy choices for the United States. Certainly, for Taiwan to be forcibly incorporated back into mainland China would be horrific. Taiwan is a much freer society than mainland China is. But what I think that is lacking in Washington is a kind of realistic assessment of when you're talking about countries that are very far away from our shores and very close to our great power adversaries, and in which their appetite for being willing to lose life in conflicts for those places, whether it's Russia and Ukraine or China and Taiwan and the South China Sea, whether their appetite is much greater than ours. Right? Policymakers, it seems to me, have to make a realistic assessment of this. And what I worry about, let's say in the case of Taiwan, is the United States is moving closer and closer to basically abrogating the promises we made in the 1970s and essentially creating an official relationship with Taiwan, in which we have virtually officially recognized it as an independent country, right? That is very provocative to China, and I think makes it more likely that China might take some kind of military action. And so essentially, we are moving towards and if China does that and calls our bluff, right? I don't think that most Americans are prepared to go to war for Taiwan, right? Chinese have a much higher appetite for that than we do, given that Taiwan is much more central to them than it is to us. And I think wise statesmen have to, and stateswomen, what people in power have to make these assessments, right, based on the notion that America has a limited amount of power in the world. And I fear that is a missing element in the foreign policy conversation today in Washington.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that the fact that we're by treaty committed to go to nuclear war in defense of Latvia is just, it's not realistic. And we need to settle some of those issues. I want to get to the audience question, but just one more thing to think about. I think you wrote this in Icarus, but you said that there's tied up in the American identity this can-do, optimistic approach, and even Biden uses this line quite a bit, that we're the United States of America. There's nothing we can't accomplish. And I think that's often seen as incredibly destructive on the foreign stage. But your thoughts on applying that can-do energy at home to solve some of the problems that we desperately need to solve?
I mean, right. I mean, look, to Biden's credit, I think he recognized, or was pushed to recognize by progressive movements inside the Democratic Party, that the irony of kind of America's post-Cold War movement was that even as America's kind of global military footprint grew wider and wider, that our society was decaying at home. And this is something that happens with empires. They focus resources on their frontiers, and often the society grows weaker and hollower domestically, and also that often the militarism that's expressed internationally can often threaten and erode democratic liberties at home. And so I think that we saw, of course, with COVID, it's just one of many examples we've seen about how hollow it looks when America kind of presents itself as this kind of model around the world, as you say, this can-do society, when we can't keep our own citizens alive, right? We can't give them health care. We can't give them a living wage. We can't provide these basic necessities of life. And so I think that Biden is, I think, recognized that to some degree, but I fear that he has not recognized sufficiently the degree to which there is ultimately a trade-off between the kind of quasi-imperial role that the United States is still playing and our need to really try to make the United States a more decent society at home.
Okay, great. I want to open it up for questions from the audience. So first hand I saw was Michael Hoey's. Michael, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. And
am I unmuted yet?
You're unmuted. Go ahead, Michael. Please keep your questions brief so we can get to everyone.
Okay, so my question is, if Israel were to compensate the Palestinian Arabs for all the land and the houses and all that was stolen in the 48 war, how would they be able to do it? What would that cost them to actually fully compensate the Arabs and their descendants for everything that was lost?
There have been some efforts actually at trying to tabulate that. I wrote about this a little bit in the essay I wrote in Jewish Currents. There's actually fairly good records that were kept by the UN in some studies they did in the 50s of Palestinian property destroyed in Israel's War of Independence, and some people have then tried to kind of extrapolate what that might mean. It's a very, very large number. You're talking about probably hundreds of billions of dollars. And I guess the view that I would take is that we're really not yet at the point where we can meaningfully engage in that level of detail. I think that, I think one of the interesting, significant things about Ta-Nehisi Coates' famous essay to the case for reparations in 2014 is that he does not actually try to kind of do the math and tell you, well, this is how much given slavery and segregation and redlining, et cetera, a check. I think we're not at that place yet. I think we're still at a place where I think people simply we still need to try to open up a dialogue of just understanding the magnitude of expulsion and of theft, of plunder. Actually, David Ben-Gurion himself, Israel's first prime minister, called it plunder, that happened to Palestinians, and then try to develop a discourse that recognizes that there is a need for historical justice, just in different ways, there's a need for historical justice in the United States, vis-a-vis Native Americans and vis-a-vis Black Americans. There's a need for historical justice in many other circumstances. And indeed, that Jews ourselves, that we as Jews have often organized in pursuit of historical justice when it comes to, for instance, the mass theft of Jewish property during World War II, let alone, of course, genocide. And so I think that we're not quite yet at that point, but I think what I was hoping to do, and again, many others have done, is at least begin to open up a conversation where we start to actually reckon with the magnitude of what was done, not just with the expulsion of Palestinians in 1948, but actually successive expulsions that have taken place since in 1967, and in some ways that are still ongoing. Even again, if you look in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah today, you see a kind of continuation of that process of expulsion of Palestinians that began with Israel's creation.
Thanks, Peter. The next hand that I saw shoot up was Ruth. So Ruth, okay, you're unmuted. Go ahead, Ruth.
Okay, thank you. This isn't specifically on Israel-Palestine, but you did say something that I thought was very good in the sense of doing targeted sanctions in the case of Iran and North Korea. The problem is that I've heard from, Persian friends, and this is relevant to Yemen as well, that if you quote unquote want to get, aid to the quote unquote people, as opposed to the regime ends up confiscating everything anyway. So would just, be happy for you to speak to that. I realize it's not exactly on Israel, Palestine, but it does come into the rubric of, world affairs and sanctions and that kind of thing. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, for this piece I did in the New York Times, I read a fair amount of literature about the impact of sanctions. And one of the interesting things one finds actually is that sanctions policies often end up strengthening repressive regimes, because what they do is they essentially destroy the legal economy. They make goods scarce. And so what regimes do is they basically then take control of that trade, and then they can use it to basically reward their friends and penalize their enemies. And one example of this, for instance, would be to look at the impact of the Israeli kind of blockading Gaza. So, when Israel essentially, intensified its blockade on Gaza, it destroyed the independent business class in Gaza and basically created a kind of a tunnel economy controlled by Hamas. So actually, it ended up weakening a kind of segment of the population that had some independence from Hamas, and actually ended up, I think, strengthening Hamas's role in power. So even if you believe that it would be, that the United States should be in the business of trying to topple repressive regimes. In fact, what we find is that these sanctions policies end up often having the opposite result. I mean, look at Cuba, right? I mean, if an embargo were effective at overthrowing the communist regime in Cuba, it would have happened decades ago, right? We've had one since the 1960s, and in fact, arguably, it's helped to solidify that regime in power. So I think this is just one reason that I think that that sanctions are often especially sanctions which are essentially a blockade or a siege on the entire population, are actually very counterproductive.
Just to continue that thought really quickly, one of my greatest concerns is that we saw during the Trump administration a big expansion of the use of sanctions by the State Department and the Treasury. Yeah. And that if those remain, if that policy remains in place during the Biden administration, then it will become normalized. Much as the use of targeted assassination by drone was normalized by the Obama administration and started by the Bush administration. Do you have a comment?
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think we need to think about these sanctions policies, again, especially when we're talking about secondary sanctions, right? Secondary sanctions are not just the US saying we're not going to trade with this country. It's basically saying that we're going to try to coerce the entire world to not trade with this country, because we're going to say, if you trade with Iran or trade with Venezuela, basically, we're going to cut you off from access to the US dollar and the US banking system, which is, most banks and businesses need access to that, right? So it seems really something that we need to stop thinking about as a kind of normal act of government policy, and really as a form of war. I mean, again, if we just think about it in simple terms, right? If you blockade a city and don't allow goods to come in or out, we would recognize that as a siege, as a kind of war, and sometimes even a more brutal form of war than other forms of military action. And yet, as you say, these things have become normalized, and it's very, very difficult for even Democrats to begin to start to challenge these. And so I think that we've dug ourselves a very, very big hole, and there's not even a really significant debate really about a lot of these sanctions policies in Washington right now.
Yes, and we are desperately trying to start one and feed the fuel. I think it's starting to pick up traction. People are starting to understand these. Let's go back to the audience. Lynn, you're up next.
So say that you took the West Bank settlers' houses and put half of Gaza into those houses and the other half of the West Bank people into the houses, and made Gaza a nice place, and East Jerusalem, leave it alone with Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, then still, this would be like California and sticking a piece of Alabama in the middle of it and sticking a piece of Kansas in the bottom of it. what is that doing? There is no place in the world that is like a state divided up all over the place and then divided into area A, B, C. It's an insidious, intentional destruction. So it's not a question of one state, two state. We should have no states. We should have no borders in the whole world entirely. But ultimately, since we do live in the real world, how can this ever be any kind of a state at all?
Your comment, Peter?
Look,
Thanks.
we're probably in reality quite far away from the kind of fundamental changes in Israel-Palestine that we would need. But I think that the basic principle, as you say, regardless of how many states one has, right? The principles are simple, right? That there should be equality under the law. People should be treated the same regardless of their religion and ethnicity. And there has to be, again, as we're just beginning to start to try to do in the United States and in Canada and Australia, there has to be an effort at historical justice so that people who were dispossessed and had their property taken, their livelihoods destroyed, were expelled, can return and can be compensated. And that may be decades away from being able to get to that reality. But I think that that you're right that the Palestinian people have been fragmented in multiple different ways. But one of the things we saw very clearly over the last few weeks is that there is one Palestinian people, whether they're Israeli citizens in Lod or Haifa or Lod, or whether they're in Gaza. Most of the people in Gaza are not from Gaza. They're mostly refugees, the children and descendants of refugees. So I think that it makes much more sense to think about there as being two peoples in Israel-Palestine, Jews and Palestinians, both of which have an integrity to them, both of whom think of themselves as one collective, and both of whom, in my view, should be able to live anywhere between the Mediterranean and the Jordan equally, under the same law, and that vision, I think, can ultimately be a powerful enough vision, I believe, that it may ultimately be able to overcome the very entrenched political forces that maintain the status quo.
Next up, I see Paul. Let me just put you up on the screen, Paul. Should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
There you go.
Done. Okay. Peter, thanks very much. I think this is really a great discussion, and I've appreciated your work. And I really support the BDS movement. Just a couple of comments. One is, you referred to the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, especially in the 1980s. Yeah. And I was a part of that. Yeah. And what I remember, we were reluctant to invoke US sanctions, but when Ron Dellums introduced a bill for comprehensive sanctions on South Africa, and overrode Ron Reagan's veto, and it also, the Commonwealth overrode Thatcher's attempt to stop it. We felt pretty good about that, because within a few years, the apartheid regime did collapse and Mandela came to power. And so I think that's the model for the BDS movement.
Yes.
I think it's a good model.
Yeah.
And I just say that I'm really happy to see the Palestinians seem to be more united. The voice seems to be more united now. That, as you said in your general statement, sanctions only make sense if the people are clearly calling for it themselves, and if they're not done out of great power ambition, or not distorted by U.S. geopolitical or imperial aims. And I just comment, I'm doing the same. I'm involved in a big campaign on Burma right now, and it's very similar. We're consciously modeling on the BDS movement. And I think there's some reluctance for people to ever invoke sanctions that might be coming from the U.S. But there are certainly, I think the cases you gave out when sanctions would be justified, I really think apply to both to Palestine and to Myanmar. Thanks.
Right. I think that there were things in place in the 1980s in the anti-apartheid movement that are not in place in the movement for Palestinian freedom. So, for instance, while you had a political leadership in South Africa, in the ANC and its local affiliate, the United Democratic Front, that was operating in tandem with the civil society. What you have in it seems to me, the Palestinians, you have this robust civil society effort, but it's disconnected from the Palestinian political leadership, right? The Palestinian political leadership is divided between Abbas, essentially a collaborationist leadership in the West Bank, and Hamas, an Islamist leadership. Neither of them can speak in the moral language of human rights and international law. And so I think you particularly, the ANC was also able to, to build a campaign around Nelson Mandela, right? Mahmoud Abbas and Hamas is not building a similar campaign around Marwan Barghouti, for instance, because they're threatened by him. The second thing was that, as you know, the UDF on the ground in the 1980s pursued an internal strategy of raising the costs, that basically to make the townships ungovernable, to raise the cost for the South African government. So it wasn't just external pressure, but internally, they realized that basically they had the equivalent of an intifada that was not ending. Whereas Mahmoud Abbas has done essentially exactly the opposite, right? He's essentially kept the West Bank quiet and made the cost much lower for Israel. So while there are elements of the strategy that echo South Africa, there are also really critical pieces that are not in place. And I think that's something that's going to make, fundamental change harder.
Absolutely. Good point.
Thanks, Peter. I saw Issam's physical hand. Issam, do you have a question for Peter?
Yes, actually, partially Paul had asked that question. I was curious about the BDS movement and where does Peter think this is going to be going, and if it's going to be able to accomplish what it meant to accomplish.
I think that I don't think that the BDS movement wholesale is going to be adopted by Democrats in Congress. I myself am not a supporter of the BDS movement wholesale, but I think there are elements of pressure that you're starting to see become more supported among Democrats. The notion of conditionality of aid, I think, there's more support for that among Democrats than there was a few years ago. And I think that the BDS movement is also very important because it speaks in the language of human rights and international law, which I think is the right and compelling kind of moral language. I think what we don't really have is with the exception of maybe Ayman Odeh, the leader of the Joint List inside Israel proper, is Palestinian political leaders who are also effectively using that language and who can be kind of rallying cries for people around the world in the way that, again, people like Nelson Mandela were in the South African case. And I hope that leadership does emerge. Unfortunately, what we see in the West Bank is this very cynical alliance, you could say, between Mahmoud Abbas, who doesn't want to lose his own power, and Israel, which doesn't want to allow Palestinians to choose legitimate representatives because they're worried that Hamas or someone else who's less compliant would win, and the United States. I mean, I think one of the things the Biden administration hasn't received nearly as much criticism for as they should have is that the Biden administration essentially gave Israel and Mahmoud Abbas the green light to cancel those elections, which was really a tragedy. Again, even though Palestinians don't have a state, even though the elections were in a certain way, kind of like holding an election in a prison, still, for Palestinians to be able to have elections would have been really valuable. And there was clearly a lot of people had registered as candidates for those elections, and yet the United States and Israel and Abbas all essentially quashed that. And so I think that this is something that, again, part of the U.S. policy that we really have to reckon with. This U.S. policy on Hamas has essentially become a policy of essentially opposing the right of Palestinians to ever actually elect a legitimate democratic leadership, because we're not willing to allow the possibility that Hamas might win, even though we're perfectly content with Israel electing leaders who are opposed to the two-state solution, who have ideologies that are deeply illiberal. And so I think that this is part of the problem in developing a Palestinian political leadership that we need.
And just one final question. I know you have a hard stop in a couple of minutes, but what does that do to American credibility on this issue? Opposing UN resolutions, as well as continuing to arm Israel during and after this most recent attack on Gaza?
I mean, I think this goes to the point about American exceptionalism. I think one of the things that American exceptionalism does as an ideology is it kind of tends to, it leads people to assume that America's virtue is kind of self-evident, right? And so therefore, you know, if we're not quite living up to something in this particular case, well, that's the exception that proves the rule. Generally, we're on the side of democracy and human rights. I mean, how many times do you hear Biden and other advisors say, we want to return democracy and human rights to the center of American foreign policy, right? As if before Donald Trump, they were at the center of American foreign policy. Of course, the vast majority of non-Americans don't see it that way, right? They don't see us as some inherently virtuous species, more better than anybody else. They look at our actions, right? And they see in the case of Israel-Palestine and in many other cases that actually we are supplying and supporting regimes that do really, really brutal things. And so then, of course, when we do speak about legitimate human rights questions in Xinjiang or with Putin's Russia or you know, in Myanmar, places where we should be speaking up, people say, okay, you're not really concerned about human rights. You're just doing this because you want to punch your enemies in the nose. You want to embarrass the Chinese or the Russians because they're adversaries. You know, one of the things that you know, I saw Chomsky has been mentioned in the chat. And I'm actually being privileged to be doing a conversation with him this Friday. You know, one of the points that Chomsky made was that we have a much greater moral responsibility for those things that our government is doing than those things that our government that are happening in places where our government is not implicated, even if those things are horrific, right? So Chomsky made this point. He said, you know, Andrei Sakharov, the great Soviet dissident, wasn't talking about America's injustices because he wasn't responsible for them. He was talking about the brutal abuses in the Soviet Union. So Chomsky said, I see my role as an American first and foremost to focus on the things that are being done in my name with my tax dollars. And too often with the Biden administration, we see it's exactly the opposite, right? We are most forceful in those situations where we have the least influence, right? And it's on those cases where we really have the most influence because it's our money, it's our weapons. That's when all of a sudden we go silent. And I think that, you know, the world sees that, even if we sometimes delude ourselves.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks for spending so much time with us and for answering so many questions from our audience. I'll give you a chance to tell people where they can find your work right there on Substack.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I just put a link if anyone is, you can sign up for free. I have a weekly newsletter I send out once a week. I also write for Jewish Currents if you're interested in questions of Israel, Palestine, and Jewish identity. And you know, write occasionally for the New York Times, and occasionally get the chance to, you know, to have really interesting conversations with folks like you. So thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. And I'll be sure to find that link to register for your talk with Noam Chomsky, because I'm sure our audience will be very interested in that as well.
That's great. Thank you all very much.
Have a fantastic night, Peter. Just in these last moments, I want to ask everyone that if you liked what you just heard, if you got something out of it, consider becoming a member of Massachusetts Peace Action. Or if you are joining from another state, look into your nearest Peace Action affiliate and join them to get involved in this important work. You know, we need all the help that we can get from activists and volunteers just like you, not only to contact members of Congress and the administration to change policy, but to help us get the word out. And another way that you can do that is by going to our YouTube page and becoming a subscriber. The more subscribers we get, the more eyes see this programming that we put out in the world. There's a big audience for this type of perspective that we provided tonight, and it's not often one that you see on the mainstream media. Peter Beinart is sort of the exception to the rule when it comes to foreign policy thinkers and writers. So it was my great pleasure, and thank you again to Peter Beinart for joining us for this past hour. Watch your inboxes, because we will be sending out a copy of this recording, and we want you to share it with all of your friends and family and everyone in your network who couldn't join us live, because it was a great conversation. And the more people hear it, the more advocacy will come out of it. And it's really up to us to spread the word. We can't count on the media to do it for us. So thank you. Well, lastly, thanks to the audience, because without an audience, no program. So I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. We couldn't do it without you, and Massachusetts Peace Action appreciates you. So with that, I will say good evening, and look out for that recording in your inboxes. Thank you so much for joining us.